Eric Kronberg, you're in good traffic. First of all, thank you so much for being here today and for joining the show this week. You're someone that we've had penciled on our wish list for a long time, putting out a lot of phenomenal stuff. I think a lot of people have seen the graphics that your organization puts out, and a lot of the breakdowns that you do on pricing for development, and how we need to change things or alter things or targets to shoot for in order to achieve the sorts of outcomes that we want when it comes to incremental development and the sorts of urbanism that we hope to see more of here in our American cities. So thanks so much for being here today and for all the great work that you do as a whole.
Super excited to be here, Brad. Let's dive in, man. I'm excited to talk.
Let's do it. So I think a great place to start, we talk a lot about urbanism and architecture and planning and all these obviously kind of crossover industries that make up this larger conversation. One thing that's always struck me about your work now that you do with your firm is that urbanism is actually in the title, and it's a core piece of what you do, obviously. And you're looking not only at architecture of buildings, but how those relationally interact and how they impact a neighborhood and a city at large. I was curious, like in the beginning when you were starting out your firm, how did you make the intentional choice that, hey, we're going to focus on more than just the architecture of one singular spot at a time? We're going to look at the fabric more.
That's such a great question. So sometimes you sort of have a gut feeling and you're stumbling in the dark towards something, but if you don't have the words or the names, it's really hard to describe what you're doing. And I worked for a couple, well, maybe all the way back. I grew up in a small, mid-sized town of 40,000 people in Findlay, Ohio. But my dad bought a farm like on the edge of town, like way away from anything urban. And so I think it was this deep desire to like get to experience cities that we didn't get to growing up that just fueled this passion of like, I don't want to live like this. I want something else. And that motivated me to get my butt to Tulane in New Orleans as like trying to embed myself deeply as I possibly could in one of the most urbanly rich cities in America and the most probably non-American urban city in America when you think about from the French and the Spanish that had such a founding impact on the form of that city before the Americans got their hands on it and didn't really mess it up. But like the DNA was established from European nations and so much of African and Creole culture as well. So that was a chance to kind of like osmosis learning of all these wonderful things. And then in addition, in the 90s, dating myself when I was at Tulane, there was a lot of emphasis on context. We had professors that were totally about design that shiny object on the hill, like that happened. But we also had a lot of professors that are like, you should look at the block and the context and the fabric. And when you're trained to like look at these blocks, and the blocks are so freaking cool with all these things that are totally illegal to do today, it just, you're absorbing things you don't even realize it. And I have had a lot of friends who stayed in New Orleans. I didn't think I could live past 40 if I did. But that gave me a chance to come back and visit a lot post-graduation while I was working and just walk the streets and realize, oh, I should probably bring a tape measure and like, how wide is this street and what is this sidewalk doing? And just really start to be intentional about noticing the fabric. And as a laboratory to do that stuff, New Orleans is amazing. I was at a Congress on Urbanism in Providence a few weeks ago. Providence, and there's so many great New England towns that have them. There's towns that are amazing, but the advice I got at some point was like, bring a small tape measure, like measure your built environment and notice and physically document what you're seeing. That is such a foundational component. And once you realize walking down the street in New Orleans, like how rich and wonderful it is. And then you might notice, oh, wait, these houses have 5-foot front setbacks, right? They actually don't have, and they have 3-foot side setbacks, and they're this tall, and the street is this narrow, and there's trees, and it feels amazing. And you're like, oh, these are the dimensions of amazing. Oh, these are illegal everywhere else in America. This is a problem. But if you know what those dimensions are, and you know how things feel, the light starts to shine. It's less completely dark. You start to realize that urbanism matters. And then you layer that on in Atlanta. We started our firm really young. We had to do a lot of scrappy projects, and we chose to do a lot of scrappy projects. Those were fun and interesting, but our clients didn't have a ton of money. And so we had to scrap out as much value of a project as we could. That meant we had to like use every inch of the site that we could. There was no fat, which meant we had to understand the zoning forward and back to figure out how to maximize outcomes. And like that means, you could only build so much and parking kicked in, so you could do a bigger patio and put the patio up by the sidewalk and, play with the rules to get to better outcomes that were not about the blingiest, shiniest architectural sculpture on the hills. Like, how do you turn a crappy gas station into a kick-ass bar and restaurant for as little money as possible? And 9 times out of 10, at least in the South, let's make a great patio, right? There's a question from Ohio. I know in the North and Northeast, patios, they're seasonal, they're amazing, but they're used less. But, if you're Virginia South, or I don't know, some line south, maybe Kentucky South, patios are critical to the success of a food and beverage establishment. And it may be totally all the way up to Buffalo. But, again, climatic differences. But patios are cheap to build and amazing to generate revenue and great for placemaking. And so it's like connecting those dots of efficiency and necessity and making great places on the cheap. Like, that's where we started from. It's a long answer.
No, that's a phenomenal answer. I'm curious, when you're starting out, right, and you have this vision for these spaces, as you mentioned, and they're obviously illegal to build, as we know, in a lot of places in the U.S. And so therefore, you would imagine, at least in terms of modern or contemporary precedents, maybe challenging to find things that were built in the last, 50, 100 years that look like what you're trying to convince folks, hey, we should be building more of this. Did you find, because we on the show, we talk a lot and we try to use American precedents more than, Europe as much as possible, just because I think it's more palatable for folks here. Yeah. When you were starting out, and maybe that was a little less common of a narrative and common of an agreed upon thing, what was kind of the way that you went about finding and putting together precedents, both in terms of real places, but also visually to show folks?
So there's a couple of things. Like, one is, like, I live in Atlanta. New Orleans is 6.5 hours away. That was a great anchor. The food's amazing. The drinks are great. The music's wonderful. Like, it's a good excuse to go back and learn, right? And have a wonderful time. But another way to answer that question, or to think about that, is, 20 years ago, nobody was talking about how ridiculous parking requirements are, right? Or were, right? And how that has such a profound impact on outcomes. And so we spent a lot of time trying to work around parking requirements to figure out how to get the most we could with triggering the least amount of parking. The simple explanation is buildings produce rent, parking lots don't. And if you want a project to be viable, you got to have more building and parking, or there's not enough revenue to justify the investment to do the thing, right? That's kind of the development math. And we were just kind of stumbling around, getting variances, using tricks and strategies to reduce the parking blight on what we were doing for our clients. And I sat down, this was like maybe 7 or 8 years, probably like 2012, like 9 years in, because it was 2012. Every architect in America had a ton of free time because it was the Great Recession. And I just made a list of all the variances and rezonings and stuff we'd done. And like 90% of them for the variances were all parking related. Like, that was and it was just like, oh my gosh. And it wasn't too long after that Donald Shoup wrote his The High Cost of Free Parking, which is a long, long book. But I swear to God, when I was reading it, I told my wife, it's like the clouds parted, the little angels with their trumpets were like blaring, and shafts of sunlight were coming down. And like, this is it. This explains the whole thing of why urbanism is destroyed. It's that. And there's a great I was listening to Strong Towns a couple months ago. Victor Dover, who's an amazing planner, was talking to Chuck Marone, and Victor had this great, he was a remembrance of Don Shoup, and Victor was basically saying that, Don was the first guy that kind of blew the lid off of zoning and showed it was completely founded on, it was a foundation of sand. It was complete BS. It was all pseudoscience. There's nothing moral or holy or right about zoning. And Don was the guy that really exposed the flank and allowed a lot of us to go in, and a lot of other reforms tagged on. And so, you talk about parking requirements, those are getting crushed across the country, state level, city level. Don really showed really scientifically and academically how inappropriate and just freaking stupid they were. And that's, but like, if you want to do good urbanism, and you want to have creative infill, you can't have ridiculous parking requirements. Like, that's the yin and the yang of things. And so all these years of practice, we've been digging under the hood to figure out where the real roadblocks are. It's usually not what you perceive, like, why don't we have nice things over on Main Street? If you still have parking requirements on Main Street, you're never going to have anything nice, right? Like, let's start with core limitations and core boundaries to redevelopment, and then try to unweave and unlock some of this craziness.
Certainly. And that book was also formative for me as well, and in getting into all of this. And also just great to know you're capable of reading something that long. That's also always a nice little confidence boost as well.
Yeah, well, I'd also put out there for, again, this is a younger audience, I'm just turned 51 at this point, but I think Adam Ruins Everything did a little animated thing with Don Shoup. That's like a 3 or 4 minute take. So if your attention span is 3 to 4 minutes on your phone, you can Google that clip. I'm sure YouTube has it. If you want to sit down and you care about urban planning, like, read the book. It's really important.
Yeah.
Like, it's the foundational Bible of, like, how do you start to make better places?
Certainly. Yeah. And Vox has a good clip that's 3 to 5 minutes, with him. And he came on this show last summer. So we did a nice hour version of it. And yeah, there's a lot of abbreviated versions, but I do encourage anybody to read that book, or at least a couple of the case studies, because it's groundbreaking and mind breaking at the same time.
Yeah.
So glad you brought that up there. I am curious. I wanted to get into some of the visuals that you and your firm create. On LinkedIn is a primary place that you share a lot of these. That's where I've become very familiar and fond of seeing your work. But I think they're very compelling because, and we talked about this, I've been talking about this with some guests recently in the new book, Abundance, that just came out. And obviously there's a lot of conversation around it. The reason I bring that up is because, to me, it's such a valuable piece because it's made something that is so technical and challenging in terms of barrier to entry for a lot of folks very accessible. And I've had people come up to me and talk about, like, the entry levels of housing policy that I never thought would be even interested in that sort of thing as a result of this book. To me, your graphics do a very similar thing. They allow people who maybe just see this come across their feed, have never really gone out on their own to dive into, a zoning or incremental development in any sort of depth, to really feel like they have a grasp on the reality of things. I'm curious at what point in your journey that you kind of realize the value of creating these very handheld, visual, sort of simple diagrams that people can really get a grasp on this sort of conversation and really be ready to come to, say, a community meeting with something already in their mind and able to approach conversation with.
So, so, like, the longer answer is, I was at a party probably back in 12 or 13, and the host, or one of the main people at the party, was a restaurant owner that owned a really amazing business in a neighborhood next to where I live, great food in an old building. And I was just talking to her about how she could never build that new. Everything she was doing was illegal from a land use perspective, right? Old building, embedded in a residential neighborhood, no parking, right? Who knows if she had a grease trap? And she was an anchor of the community. And I was just talking to her about all the ways she's illegal, and she didn't really care. She's like, dude, stop talking. I want to talk about, like, I don't know, Walking Dead or something. But it really hit that, like, this was an amazing thing that she was doing. And nothing about it met any law or regulation that we allowed anywhere else in the city. And how you have examples to have citizens understand, like, the roadblocks matters. Layering on that, I was like a zoning chair and a neighborhood president and vice president for, like, I don't know, a decade over time. So I'd present to communities for projects for approval. I'd see applications come in. We'd see all this process about how do you break down complicated things to neighborhoods to try to get to a yes. So, like, there's all this foundational practice we were doing. And then we did a lot of work for friends and clients in New Orleans that was taking a whole bunch of blighted historic homes and renovating them to National Park Service, historic tax credit standards. The client was really complicated, low-income housing tax credits. It was like all these regulations stacked on top. But we did a whole bunch of housing this way that was really transformative to some blighted neighborhoods post-Katrina, before New Orleans was really going crazy from a housing cost standpoint. And he submitted the project to the National Trust, and we got, like, a national award for the project. And there wasn't that much architecture in it, right? It was project management, it was historic preservation. These were old houses that basically needed to go back to what they were with some minor floor plan reno changes, right? So if you think about what an architect does, it wasn't that much in air quotes compared to this, but the project was insanely transformational. It went on to win like all these awards. And we put together a presentation to talk about it. And that was one of our earliest presentations to try to show like we had to navigate all these complex systems. And this is how we broke it down. And this is how this worked. And how we got solar panels with historic buildings and did this and did this. And realized that trying to simplify complexity is something we're good at. And we had a pretty good sense of how do we make some graphics to explain that. So that was one of the earliest presentations. I think it's up on our website talking about that project. But over time, a lot of it, we're so frustrated with the city of Atlanta and its lack of project on housing reform that I get mad and frustrated. I'm like, screw it, let's make some charts and graphs and get it out there. And so what's happened over the last 3 years is we've been doing like these deep hour-long presentations for over a decade. We're always using, building, testing, refining, changing graphics, seeing what resonates with audience members and what doesn't. And we write some blog posts too every now and then, but I'm a much better helping get graphics right than writing a blog post. My writing skills are a lot better with ChatGPT proofreading, but before ChatGPT, there was very marginal. Lots of great ideas, hard to understand, hard to follow. And so we were trying to figure out, we had one guy in our office who was a great editor. He went on to start his own firm, so we lost our in-house editor. We're trying to, what do we do? Like, I don't have all the time to, labor over these posts anymore. And I realized, we've got a decade of presentations with all these graphics that are really easy to take snippets out of and throw on LinkedIn. And so I just started trying that. And yeah, like that's really helpful for LinkedIn, like these quick hits, charts and graphs you can look at for 30 seconds and, this. I mean, we've really upped our game to animated GIFs, right? Like, we stepped up graphically. I mean, and like you've got a chart and graphs that flips a few pages. Holy crap, like, this is amazing, right? But we're always presenting, and a lot of this is like, we don't pay for marketing at all. We put all our resources into these presentations, right? And I get so frustrated when I see if I see an architect or presenter, like it's the same presentation from 2 years ago, like you haven't like updated it. We're constantly tweaking stuff and trying stuff. And what's really nice for presenters is a lot of people try to memorize their presentation and, oh my gosh, they've got to get and it's a lot of work to do this stuff. I just follow the slides. Like every presentation, we'll throw like 200 slides together. I don't have to memorize anything. I just show up and just roll through the slides and riff on it. So we have like all these sequences, like series of things that we tweak. But I may take like 12 sequences and arrange them in a way. Like that was a presentation in Seattle like 2 weeks ago. I'm going to speak to AI Florida in a week. It was a CNU Providence. Like it's all kind of exactly what's the pain point, and we just kind of shuffle some things around to best address the pain point, and then it's a whole new presentation. But it also makes it really easy because I don't have to remember anything. It's all my ass up to show up. Oh yeah, this is how the ride's going. And so it takes all the stress off of it. I can have some fun with it, but we're also always testing, talking about cost of transportation, trying to frame things based on, area median income and percentage of housing costs and transportation costs, and how trying to connect dots that people don't think about. Like I was frustrated this morning, and we've got a local professor who does great housing policy stuff. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. But he had a great post last night linking the Senate version of the Big Beautiful Bill and how it's going to, cause all these impacts by decreasing discretionary spending for low-income earners, which means they're going to lose their housing, which means a massive increase in homelessness and a huge devastation for so many parts of America, particularly rural America. And The Economist had a chart yesterday that showed like their expectation to reduce income based on income bracket or income gain. Trust me, if you're making $50,000 or less, you're going to get your ass kicked. I mean, that's the outcome. and then calibrated to Harvard, their Joint Center for Housing is doing amazing work. Free reports every year. Their latest one just dropped like a week and a half ago. They've got this great chart where they're looking at like how much money do you have left after paying for housing by income level. And the chart is just like spiking so negative into deep negative territory. If you're making 30,000 or less, like you're screwed. And so if you're making 30,000 or less, all of a sudden food stamps go away and healthcare goes away. You're not staying housed. You're not staying housed. So here we are.
Yeah. No, the report's phenomenal, and those are all great resources, even in sobering times and stuff you don't necessarily want to read. It's still very helpful to, to check in with those things, I think. And it sounds like your presentations also reflect that in terms of a constant update, which I think is really neat to hear. I also am like you when I listen to things and they have only data from mid 20 teens, it's challenging to know how it applies in the current day. So it's really cool to hear. I wanted to zoom in on one slide in one of your presentations that I have always, when I saw it recently, completely was a different way to look at some of this conversation than what even I'd kind of gotten into before in some of these similar circles. And that was looking at the changing demographics around household size and square footage of things. And this is something that I actually haven't heard discussed as much. As after I saw this, I was like, this is seems like a big deal. I feel like we should talk about this square footage piece a little more, because I think a lot of times when you talk about density and you talk about, building smaller homes, there's a sect of the population that understandably at times sees that as, well, why would we go against, some of the prosperity that we've realized in terms of larger and bigger and go backwards? And what it actually shows is that we're kind of right sizing our homes more than anything. Like, it's gotten the amount that this has gone up, in terms of square footage of living space per person from in the 200s to now above 1,000 is a wild sort of situation to look at after seeing your graphics. So I thought that was interesting. Would love to kind of dive into that a bit if you have.
It's amazing how like sometimes you get that one slide that just like nails it.
Yep.
And so this is, and so just to contextualize it for folks listening, a lot of our stuff we get, AARP does amazing housing work, right? So first of all, their housing division, lifelong communities division, they do great stuff. They put out a great report. This is 2018, so it's old, but it hasn't really changed, called Making Room. Google it. It's a great one to download. We took a lot of their stuff and just updated the graphics, right? And so one of the things they talked about is I think it was like 1949 to the 1950s, the average house size being built post-World War II was just under 1,000 square feet. And the average household size was 3.8 people, or just around 4. So that means we were building at about 280-ish square feet per person. And if you just think about that, that's not that much space. And when you think about a cost per square foot, if you build less, it will cost less, right? This is not dramatic math. By 2017, when AARP put the report out, they noted that the average family size had decreased to 2.5 people. That trend line continues to go down. And the average house size had bloated to about 2,600 square feet. We were building 2,700 square feet. We're building about 1,000 square feet per person right now. We're building 3.5 times as much house per person as we were 70 years ago. And it's like, well, yeah, that should cost 3.5 times as much. It's 3.5 times more of it. Like, it's basic math. You build a big house, it's going to cost more. But here's the thing that the point to think about: builders build what is legal. If you only allow one house per lot, and that house can be 3,000 square feet, that is the natural response of a builder to the legal environment they exist in. So builders are just trying to make a living building housing that's legalized, and you got to build the most economically viable thing you can with the land to stay in business. So there's no shade on the builders. They're just doing what the laws say they should do. The laws say you should build a 3,000 square foot house and do that. The other thing I want to tie with this, when we talk about the current housing crisis, and this has been something that's harder for me to explain. I don't have exactly like the slide yet that I want to get. But when you think about Atlanta, I'll use an example. In Atlanta in 1970, I think it was like 70, we hit peak population of like 499,000 people in the city. And so we think about people per household are probably at like 3.2 or 3.4 people from like the 1950 trend line down to now, where Atlanta is really closing in to 2.2 people per household, right? But the simple math is if you go from 4 people per household to 2 people per household, like you have your household size, you need double the units of housing to house the same number of people. Okay? This is basic multiplication division, like, 2 and 4, right? Not crazy, not even threes or crazy numbers, right? So you need twice as many houses in your city for the same number of people based on family size changes. People don't ground this, and this is very much a Rust Belt situation, and not to pick on the Rust Belt, but to highlight it, you could have zero population growth and still have a housing crisis based on household change in size. Mm-hmm. The other thing that we try to tie in to explain to folks is the white flight for most larger cities. First of all, it was intentional by FHA. They crafted mortgages that were intentionally cheaper to buy than it was to rent, right? But you could only buy in the burbs. So this was a government-funded city depopulation strategy. Okay, so all the bad history there, but we vacated our cities, in the 60s and 70s. So our cities, Atlanta in particular, somebody says, have all the slack housing, right? So over the past 50 years, so many of these neighborhoods, housing has been bought, housing has been renovated, housing has been torn down and put new. We have basically been working through our slack housing stock for the past, let's say from 2000, from gentrification, first, millennial, whatever, kids coming in, urban pioneers. We were just working through the slack capacity we had. Right now, most American cities figure out there's no more slack capacity. It's all gone. So we've kind of taken the edge off for the pain of housing demand, using up all our underutilized housing stock in neighborhoods that white folk didn't want to live in because they were blighted and poor and whatever. There's very few blighted poor neighborhoods in Atlanta anymore because everybody's trying to find a house no matter your background, right? Yeah. And this plays out in many cities. But people don't understand that our housing policy, our allowed housing, is not keeping up with what the needs are. And they don't understand how we had this buffer that's been burned through that doesn't exist anymore. That was part of the situation. So that's a long answer on one slide too.
No, it's wonderful. I think that too, it makes you wish, for me, it makes me wish so badly that there were more methods of mass communication at the time when some folks saw this coming. And it would have been easier to articulate, I think, that this was, that we were using up that slack volume at an earlier point. And if that was more discernible to a larger population, I think that would have been very helpful at an earlier time period. But I don't know, maybe that's just hopeful thinking.
Well, one of the things, it took me 30 years to figure that out, right? Like this is one of those aha moments of when you look at the demographics and household size. We do a lot of work in transitioning neighborhoods, provide attainable housing. You're trying to minimize displacement, do all these things. And then you finally realize, part of what we've been projecting for Atlanta, and again, we're here, it's grounding, but there's been a lot of growth projections for the region, which become a question of, do you live in a drive-only suburban environment? Do you come to the city? What happens? And projections are all estimates. They're based on all kinds of, whatevers. But we're like, there's potentially 2 million people that are supposed to move to Atlanta over the next 20 years, 15 years, 20 years at this point, basically. That's basically Denver's population coming here. And we're like, okay, well, how many of those people could want to come live in the city if there was housing? If it's like 10%, 15%, 20%, like what are we talking about? That's somewhere between 300 to 500,000, maybe even another 700,000 people out of the region. So there's a 2 million coming, 8 million people in the region. If 15% of your population, this is such crude math, want to live in a walkable, urban, drive-less environment, that means the city should be a population of 1 million too. Like if we could build the housing, that's the demand of people that would like to live in Atlanta if they could afford it. And we're like 520,000. And so you're like, oh shit. Like you start to think about this. Like, okay, well, 700,000 people in 20 years, that's like 25, 22 no, it's like 30,000 people a year. I'm trying to remember the chart. 30,000 people a year moving to town. And if you want to have housing based on household size for them, you need like 15 to 16,000 units of housing annually produced. If the city is going to meet its goal, right, for just the new people that want to come. And if you don't meet your goal, the wealthiest come in and shove out the poorest because you're not meeting your housing demand. And so, like, what are we doing in Atlanta? It's like 5 to 8,000 units of housing a year. And it's gotten, we peaked in 24 post COVID, like a lot of cities did. But like, not only we're at 8 or 9,000, so we're running at a deficit of 6, 8, 9,000 units of housing a year. And you wonder why there's a housing crisis in Atlanta and every other city in America, like, because we don't have a handle on the forces and demographics and income and in-migration and what does it mean. And every day you don't solve the problem, existing homeowners' houses get exponentially more valuable.
Yeah.
And so you have this huge disincentive to change the system because everybody that got that house, you know, were pretty excited and don't want any change that could disrupt the status quo, keeping things scarce for them to truly benefit.
Sure. Yeah. And another thing that I think you've done a salient job of pointing out in a lot of what you've put out, and something that, again, has helped, I think, in some conversations I've had too with, I think we're all trying to think about the opposition in a lot of these conversations and how to properly address their concerns or meet them where they're at to try to get them on the same page as us. And obviously with NIMBYs, that can be very challenging depending on the subculture within that larger group that we're talking about. One thing that I think that you've put out that's been very helpful to me is not just looking at smaller starter homes and cottage courts and things of that nature as for younger people ascending the housing ladder, but also for folks that are looking to downsize in their later years. And I think that's been really helpful in terms of just anecdotally conversations I've had at looking at, okay, so a lot of what's happening too is folks don't have a place to go later in their life when they want to downsize because there's also not that smaller footprint house that we've been talking about. And so a lot of this is the folks that are living and staying in their very large home and that want to maintain the neighborhood character. And then, all this other complication comes around that. And in terms of the political conversation that we have, it stems too from this same exact issue. And perhaps if there were more options for those folks looking to downsize back down the gradient, we would also have a more a cohabitating sort of situation when it comes to our neighbors, and the NIMBY population perhaps would shrink because they would see personal benefit in the gradient as well.
I that feels like a really optimistic, hopeful thing for humanity.
Probably is.
Let me give you a different approach on it. And this was from, I'll tie two stories together. There was a Congress for Urbanism. They had the first Congress post-COVID out in Oklahoma City, and there's a great panel with some really smart folks talking about NIMBY versus urbanism and stuff like that. And they're talking about a range of issues really good. And one of the guys, not on the panel, was in the front row. He's like, look, man, I'm a city council member. Like, I get all the things I should be voting for. I understand complete streets. I understand mixed single housing. But when I'm at a council hearing and I've got 50 neighbors screaming about how awful this is, and there's not a single person coming to talk in favor of it, and I want to vote for it, and I've got no political cover of any kind to say yes to the right thing, it's really hard. And the takeaway is, it's not that politicians are spineless. A lot of them are, but they need somebody to say this is the right thing. And he's like, I don't need it to be 50 to 50, right? You could have 3 or 5 people speaking rationally about why a policy really matters. Those voices could carry more weight than 20 or 30 people in opposition, because the people in opposition say all the same shit. It's going to be the same stuff every time. So part of this that, when the NIMBY movement really was founded in San Francisco is helping to understand that if a project is proposed in neighborhood A and nobody under 30 can afford to live in neighborhood A, right? You can still, if you're a member, you're a resident of the city, you can still come out and support these things to get the change going, right? It's a longer arc, but if you don't show up, your voice isn't heard. And what's really difficult, I think, for a lot of younger generation folks, I don't want to be like these kids these days, but it's a lot of people, like a lot of the stuff you just have to physically go and sit there and wait for your turn at the mic and burn like 3 hours on a Tuesday night. And man, it sucks. Like listening to all these NIMBYs rant and rave. I mean, getting them bingo, the little bingo game where you can play when you hear the crazy things. Find a way to gamify it, find a way to keep your sanity. But like, that's how the system is set up, right? There's not a bunch of slick online polls where you can just click an easy button on your phone. You've got to invest your time. And so, we were talking right before we jumped on, like, what do you do when you're young and interested in community development and these things? Generally speaking, most folks are cash poor, but probably time rich, right? And so figuring out how these council meetings, the hearings, like these are where decisions are made, figuring out how to go and speak, but not just like you as the one crank that's, the weird 25-year-old coming to speak every time. Get a group of friends, right? Like playing them bingo, whoever wins, like everybody else buys them a drink afterwards to restore your sanity. Like figure out a way to make this like bearable with friends. Because if you get 5 or 6 people to show up, like that's way better than the one lone person.
Sure.
Right. But that's the entree to where the stuff goes.
Certainly.
And then you might realize, holy crap, all these real decisions are made when the city budget's put out. Like that's the real decision point. And then you start to think about things like that, when and how to engage.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's something that a lot of funny enough, right? In the time of over information, a lot of us are still very not aware of like when a council meeting is. Us in terms of like residents in a city, young residents in a city, when there's a lot of competition for attention. But to your point, it's probably still, as analog as it sounds, you get the greatest marginal benefit and return for doing it. And that's a self-reflection for me too. I put a lot of effort into a national conversation here for young folks. I still think I need to do a better job of going and actually just going, hey, I'm going to go walk down the street. It's great that somebody, all these people in California might tune in, but I need to go walk down the road, and I need to have that conversation too. And it's hard to have a national conversation about local things. And remember that you have to also stay local with the progress that you're trying to, trying to achieve in that as well. I did not know you were from Ohio. That is a exciting thing. I live in Columbus, so I'm excited to hear that in a way as well. It makes me wonder if there's anything you mentioned, kind of some of the things you saw growing up. Is there anything, like, we do have some people who listen that are not living in cities or not from cities and are looking for their next move potentially, and where they want to maybe go and move to a place that has the sorts of lifestyle and things that they're looking for in terms of walkability and the like. Is there any, maybe not necessarily places, but the criteria, like when you were looking to move into a place like that, how did you evaluate and make a decision?
Like I saw New Orleans in February after coming from the Midwest, and I was like, oh, like this is easy, right? But that was a college kid, or high school to college. One of the things I like to clarify with folks is we talk about small town and big city, and the word urban usually means a lot of negative things to a lot of folks from smaller towns. And I like to try to say, look, let's use the word urban in terms of physical form, not about race, not about density. But you could live in a town of 500 people and you could have a 2-block main street. That is an urban condition, right? Your urbanism might be 2 blocks, and then it might be kind of scattered on the edges. I grew up driving through like towns that were a blinking traffic light, right? They had one crossroads and some housing. So I grew up around all these different scales of community. And this isn't to say one or the other, but it's like there are towns of 1,000 to 2,000 people that have a main street that's had its tail kicked, right? They're in really bad shape. Like places that are doing things to reinvest in itself, that you can afford to buy into walkability and, maybe find a way to do something on a main street. The barriers to entry are a lot lower there. The incomes and rents are a lot lower too, right? So you have competing forces. But the guys at Yard, they're great urban thinkers. They do a lot of stuff. I got to hang out and see Dayton, Kentucky, which is just across the river from Cincinnati. There's a series of small towns right along the river. And like there's like the main road, and you got like the coffee shops and some restaurants and some bars, like housing all around. And then Cincinnati is across the way, but like that was a great example of really cool stuff. right? And so part of it is what's meaningful. What are your job opportunities? How does remote work play into that or not, as things are constantly shifting? And then you also have to weigh income opportunity and just social opportunity of places, and that's harder. The best thing I can say about Atlanta, well, something I can say about Atlanta. I toured our head of city council around a project I was doing, and he got here like the mid '90s. I got here in '98, and what he and I talked about is Atlanta in the '90s. If you were an artist, if you were gay, if you just wanted something else, like you would find your way to Atlanta, and you could take a shot at whatever you wanted to do, and you could fail and start over and try something else because housing was cheap. Like it was a low risk environment with a high reward to try things. Like it's not like New York City where like if you failed, man, you're homeless. Like you could do that in Atlanta in the '90s and try many things, right? All kinds of wacky stuff, and you can't do that anymore. It's too hard. And he called it a foothold city. You could come to Atlanta, get a foothold, and figure out who you are, right? You can't do that anymore. So the social opportunity becomes a lot harder in Atlanta because it's so expensive, right? You've got to figure out, all right, I'm going to study to be a computer scientist or whatever the thing is. You have less opportunity to try things and experiment. And so, we do a lot of work in Chattanooga. I love that city. Chattanooga is a wonderful city, all kinds of natural stuff all around for hiking and climbing. And it doesn't have the same horsepower of Atlanta, but you've got more chances to try things. And so it's trying to figure out this balance of what's a foothold place with opportunity to test and try and see what happens versus the cost of failure. And we've made the cost of failure so dramatic in America through lack of support and changes in federal policy and all around. It's really hard. So I think it's just to point out that Gen Xers, there weren't a lot of us, and the cities were vacant, and you could buy a cheap house in a crappy neighborhood and try stuff with roommates, right? Like our chances to experiment were way better than kids. Right now it's such a hard thing. And so we talk about like the town of 1,000 to try to plug into versus in Atlanta. Like there's so few development opportunities in Atlanta because it's so expensive and so everywhere I go, it's so hard. Like where on the scale from like New York to Atlanta to Chattanooga to Columbus to like Lima to Findlay, Toledo, like where is your opportunity? And what's also a positive sense is like you look at we're doing some work in Tulsa, you look what Indianapolis is doing, you look at Fort Wayne's trying stuff, Toledo's trying stuff. All these mid-tier cities realize they're in their own way. And they've got to get out of their way if they want folks to be able to build housing, to try things, to do things. So a lot of these cities are really trying, and I'm calling it blue tape now. That's my new thing. I heard that the other day from Jamie Dimon. It's cut the blue tape. It's usually not the red tape that you're trying to cut. Get the blue tape out of the way so that there's a chance to do stuff. And I feel like the opportunities are happening more in the Tulsas, the Indies, the Columbuses than they are in the Atlantas or the LAs or, Texas is always Texas. There's no tape in Texas. It's kind of wide open.
Tape-free environment.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I did want to ask you on the solution set side of things and the, tangible physical building side of things, a little bit about the Incremental Development Alliance and some of what you're doing there and some of the real, putting shovels in the ground and also supporting others that are doing the same thing and trying to, rising tide around all of the folks like myself that I put in that boat of who want to get into this and chipping away at the problem and offering solutions. Would you mind just giving kind of a quick background on what you all do and a little bit of a pitch there for folks that want to get more involved?
Oh, absolutely. So Incremental Development Alliance started in 2015 as a nonprofit to just teach the basics of small development, right? It's a demystification process. Ideally, it's in its original core mission was to train 1,000 small developers across the country. And there's a core group of folks that was their primary. There was another group of us that thought that was totally fine, but if you train folks up to build stuff that's all fully illegal in their places, you're really setting them up for failure. Yeah. And so a lot of us also saw there was deep benefit in getting city officials and city staff to these exact same trainings. One, so people could talk across the table and meet each other, but to demystify development math to planners that are trying to figure out why nothing nice is getting built in their town.
Mm.
right? And a lot of it's just math, right? And to explain how regulations directly impact outcomes. And if you want these better outcomes and they happen to be illegal, well, city, you've got to play a part in changing this stuff. So it's both kind of looking at the spectrum of how do you create an environment where you can self-perform the kind of things you'd like to see in your town without begging a big developer to come from out of town and throwing a bunch of money at him to solve the problem in a really lumpy, bad way. So like that's kind of the core mission. It's been true to serving both of those sides of the coin to make better places. And it's grown and evolved. And a lot of our work and our firm has been in response to all the things we've learned from teaching. And one of the things we've learned from teaching is that, if you're in a small town, you are never going to be able to afford an architecture firm from Atlanta. Like there is just no math where a project will make sense. And so what we've done over the years for a lot of our attainable housing work is realize we need to have a really, really good library of simple cottages that we can just sell as a product. Because you could afford to buy a cottage from us that's already designed. You could never afford to have us custom design a house for you, right? So how do you provide a solution that we can, as a design firm, based on what we learned in Incremental Development Alliance that folks need? The other thing we've shown and learned and just known is you can never solve these problems one house for a lot. Like that math doesn't work. And so a lot of what we talk about is we need regulations to be revised a lot around subdivision ordinances and minimum lot size. Strong Towns is talking a lot about this now. I got to be fortunate to help them last year, I think, through some housing policy stuff, which is in their housing ready city stuff, where they're talking about you need to allow, up to 3 units of housing per lot. You need to allow smaller lot sizes. And so the simplest way we talk about this for folks is most folks understand what accessory dwelling units are, ADUs, and they may understand that you could have a primary house and you could attach an ADU to it, and you could put an ADU in the back that would be detached. What we explain is that's great as the things to build, but if you want that housing to actually get built, most builders build to sell because they don't have enough cash to build and hold and rent. So you need to change your subdivision ordinance to allow all of those 3 units, the primary, the attached, and the detached ADU, to be sold as individual houses on their own land. That's how you coordinate the financial markets with conventional single-family mortgages, with zoning, with ADUs, with subdivision ordinances, with building code to allow stuff to happen at the scale of a small town in Ohio or Kansas or Nebraska, because local builders can build an 800 square foot cottage, right? We have the technical capacity to do that. You try to do an 8-plex, that's really hard to figure out just technically and financially in a small town where they haven't been built for 100 years. But you can figure out how to build an 800 square foot cottage or a 600 or 400 square foot cottage. That's basic residential construction.
Yeah.
And you could do 3 of those on a lot and sell them. That's housing that people can afford to buy.
Yeah.
Right. Because even if you sell that cottage at $300 a foot, which is crazy for small towns, it's still $120,000. Right. And you sell 3 of those on one lot, that's $360,000 of real estate, revenue produced out of one lot. And that might be a lot that could support a $100,000 house otherwise, right? Again, different markets, different math, but it's understanding smaller lot size, fractionalizing ownership of standard lots, if you will, different ways to describe this with complicated terms. That's how you Venn diagram and overlap, all these different forces to find a very narrow seam of possibilities.
No, thank you for that. That's super helpful. And again, we'll link all this sort of stuff below that you've put out and some of the different places folks can kind of go and see this visually and physically to get a better grasp as well. But I mean, it's the type of thing that I think folks like myself are looking for. And so I'm excited that they'll be able to find it more and more. I did want to ask you with two quicker questions here at the end. First, thinking about all the things that you have your hand in now in terms of the different work that you all know is important and that you've identified as where you should spend your time. If you had a weekend or a week to teach yourself a new skill or something, knowing what you know now, if you had a set of hours that you could dive into something that you say, this would be worth the time. It's maybe not the most expected thing, that I would need to know, based on going to school or whatever, what do you think something would be that folks should maybe dive into, whether it's on YouTube or via a book or something like that?
Okay, so the quick answer for me, which I'm at a very different place, the thing I want to spend time on now is I want to figure out who the partners are to create an ALEC for state level housing policy for red states across the country. Because I think most of this action is going to happen at the state level, and ALEC is done gun laws, which are like I'm not supportive of, but they figured out how to hand out policy written for legislatures across the country, and they've been highly effective. I'm trying to figure out who are the partners to do that for housing policy across the country, because I think most of this action is state level. That's what I see as like the most impactful thing for housing policy for America for the next 3 to 5 years, right? Some states are doing it, but nobody knows like what's a good law written or bad law written. Like, and legislators are happy to have it handed to them, right, by lobbyists. How do we get a lobbying group to get the right stuff out there? I think that if you're starting out and you're trying to figure out skills, we sat around having beers, a bunch of us in Inc. faculty years ago. Almost all of us got into real estate by buying a crappy old house and renovating it and learning how to learning the nuts and bolts and how to fix an old house, right? How to sell it, all the components of that as a process. That's really foundational. Right. And it's not sexy. And this isn't about like, hey, you should go flip stuff as a way to make your money, but learning to renovate a house with somebody else, that can help maybe guide if you're not fully in there, learning that process, learning by doing, getting your hands dirty. It's hard to really understand the stuff if you haven't done it. Like the stress of, oh shit, we haven't had a buyer look at it for 2 weeks, understanding the pain and suffering of like what it takes to sell a house, buying a house, all those transactional components, like market study. And that's all the stuff IncDev teaches. And IncDev talks about like a range of things. But at the end of the day, if you take an IncDev class and you just learn how to safely tackle renovating a single house, your skill sets and knowledge will go up fundamentally.
Yeah. Wow, I love that ALEC idea as well. That's such an interesting thought. I'm intrigued to see how that continues to progress for you as well.
We're talking to a lot of groups about, and I fundamentally I may have to go talk to somebody at ALEC. I mean, I'm not opposed if that's a group that wants to push good policy. Like, you want to push good policy? Let's have a conversation.
Yeah. I love that. Well, the last question we ask everybody that comes on the show, all the places you've lived in your life, all the places you've worked, show's called Good Traffic. We talk a lot about the journey, the commute. I would just love to know what your favorite commute that you've ever had in your life has been.
I've had, oh man. Okay. So I'm jealous. I have hoped for, maybe lusted for commutes. I will say in Atlanta, I get to ride 1.5 miles through great old neighborhoods on an e-bike, and it's even when it's hot, it's beautiful and wonderful. Like, I dream of an Amsterdam style commute where, it's that 5 to 10 minutes where you have everything right there. I think I have a very Americanized version where I can pass by a bar, I've got some great food, but I also go through a reasonably decent design power center so I can stop by Kroger and Lowe's on the way home on my bike to get things. So it's not Amsterdam sexy, but it's highly functional, an Americanized version. It even has a main street that I bike on. But we were staying in New Orleans at a friend's house, Lower Garden District, close to Magazine Street. And just to realize that in 4 blocks, you've got food, beer, coffee, shopping, there's everything. And even if you can just try that as an Airbnb for a weekend to realize how bonkers walkable urbanism is, it's really, really, really powerful. And then this is diverging, but I took my son, we're doing college visits. We got to visit Providence for a weekend in February, and we stayed at College Hill, south of Brown. This is like an 1850s neighborhood. And just walking around this neighborhood, explaining how this was the commercial street, and this is where urbanism is so rich and vibrant and amazing, and it's so disappointing that more people don't get to experience it. And so it's not just that ideal commute, it's test it out. We're a huge e-bike proponent. If you've never ridden an e-bike, find a safe place to rent one of those limes or spins or jumps or whatever they are. They're life-changing. man, if you're open to it, you're like, oh my God, my life can be so much better. Oh my God, I could walk and bike places. I don't have to sweat, even in the South. Like your commutes could be radical without a car. Radically amazing.
Eric, thanks so
Yeah.
much for your time today. This has been wonderful.
Awesome, Brad. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. All right, bye.